The lake cabin had always been my escape, a secluded property tucked away from the chaos of city life, hidden behind pine trees that stretched to the sky and hugged the edge of crystal-clear water, the kind of place where silence spoke louder than traffic, where the only interruptions came from the hum of cicadas in summer or the crunch of snow under boots in winter, and where no one could bother me. At least that's what I thought until Karen, the self-appointed queen of our HOA, decided otherwise. I had bought the cabin years before the subdivision expanded, years before a homeowners association even existed, back when the land was raw and unclaimed by committees with clipboards and self-righteous smiles. The cabin sat on its own parcel, separate from the HOA's jurisdiction, with its own access road and lake rights, but that never stopped Karen from insisting that all properties in the area must adhere to community standards. Her words were like a broken record at meetings, and while most people rolled their eyes and ignored her, I knew she was itching for a confrontation with me specifically, because unlike others, I didn't cower at her threats or pay her ridiculous fines. I had built the cabin myself, every plank of wood, every stone in the fireplace, every nail hammered in with my own hands, and the place meant something to me beyond just property. It was a symbol of freedom from the nonsense she represented, which is exactly why I chose that cabin for my meeting with the state attorney general, a man named Robert Langford who had grown up in small towns like ours and knew firsthand the kind of havoc a rogue HOA president could wreak. I had invited him there not just as a friend, but because my role in law enforcement and my ties with the community had put me in a unique position. Residents had been quietly complaining to me about Karen's abuses for years, from arbitrary fines to legal threats of foreclosure, and Langford wanted to see for himself how bad things had gotten. Before pursuing state-level action against her AO, we were supposed to meet in peace, quietly, and away from prying eyes. And we might have if Karen hadn't decided that very morning to march across the boundary line, shove open my cabin door without permission, and storm inside like she owned the place. I'll never forget the look on her face when she saw me sitting at the rustic oak table across from the Attorney General of our state, coffee mugs steaming between us and files spread across the tabletop like evidence in a courtroom. Her mouth dropped open, her usual shrill lecture dying in her throat as Langford calmly looked up from the papers and asked, in that steady voice of his, "And you are?" Karen stammered, struggling to process what she had just walked into, and then launched into a tirade about how my cabin was out of compliance with community rules, that it had improper structures, and that unapproved guests, like him, were forbidden on HOA properties. That last line nearly made me spit out my coffee, because the sheer arrogance of this woman claiming that the top law enforcement officer of the state was an unapproved guest in my own home was too much even for me. Langford, to his credit, didn't flinch. He closed the file he was reading, leaned back in his chair, and fixed Karen with the kind of look that made seasoned prosecutors tremble. "Ma'am," he said slowly, "this property is not under your association's authority. You have no jurisdiction here. More importantly, you just unlawfully entered a private residence. Do you realize the gravity of that?" But Karen was too blinded by her own delusions of grandeur to catch the warning in his tone. She puffed up like a rooster, pointing her finger at me. "He's lying to you. This man has been violating our rules for years, building without permits, holding unauthorized gatherings, ignoring letters from the board. And as president of the HOA, I demand that whoever you are, support me in enforcing community standards." I leaned back, watching the absurdity unfold like theater, because I knew Langford wasn't just any guest. He was the very man who could dismantle Karen's little empire brick by brick, and she had just given him front row seats to her arrogance. He stood up slowly, his tall frame towering over Karen, and pulled a leather wallet from his coat pocket, flipping it open to reveal his official badge and ID, Robert Langford, State Attorney General. "And you, Miss Walker, just trespassed into a meeting regarding your association's conduct. Congratulations, you've officially escalated your problems from HOA politics to state law." Karen's face went pale, then red, then pale again, like a malfunctioning traffic light, and for the first time since I had known her, she was speechless. The silence stretched so long I could hear the clock ticking above the fireplace. Finally, she sputtered, This is harassment. You can't, but her words crumbled into incoherence as Langford calmly took out a notepad and began writing. He asked her full name, the HOA's official name, and whether she was aware of the legal limits of HOA's diction. Karen, still puffing, tried to regain footing by insisting she had implicit authority over all properties in the community, even those not formally within the HOA's boundaries, because otherwise it sets a dangerous precedent. Langford actually laughed at that, an honest, deep laugh that made Karen blink in shock. Dangerous precedent? No, Miss Walker, what's dangerous is an HOA president who believes she's above the law. That's why I'm here. And now you've provided me first-hand evidence. I sipped my coffee, hiding my grin, because it was better than any revenge I could have orchestrated. Karen, realizing she had walked straight into the lion's den, tried to backpedal, claiming she had only entered because she heard suspicious activity in my cabin, implying she had been protecting the community. But Langford wasn't buying it. He told her in no uncertain terms that if she didn't leave immediately, she would face charges for trespassing, obstruction, and potentially even harassment. Karen opened her mouth to argue again, but I stood, pointing to the door. You heard the man out. For a split second, she looked like she might refuse, like she might double down on her arrogance. But then she saw Langford reach into his jacket not for a weapon, but for his phone, and suddenly the fight drained out of her. She spun on her heel and stomped out, slamming the cabin door so hard the windows rattled. The silence that followed was sweet, broken only by the soft whistle of the wind through the pines. Langford sat back down, shaking his head. Well, he said with a dry smile, I think we've seen enough to justify moving forward. And that's how the battle truly began, not with paperwork or hearings, but with Karen barging into my sanctuary, unknowingly throwing herself directly into the path of the very man she feared most. After Karen's stormy exit from the cabin that day, the stillness she left behind was almost eerie, like the woods themselves were pausing to listen for what would come next. But I knew better than to think that was the end of it, because Karen was not the type to accept humiliation quietly, especially not after discovering she had walked into a meeting with the state attorney general himself. And sure enough, by the very next morning the neighborhood buzzed with fresh gossip, flyers slipped under doors, and emails from the HOA declaring serious violations on my property, all of which I recognized instantly as her attempts to reassert control after being exposed. But the difference now was that she had revealed her hand to someone with real authority, and Attorney General Langford wasn't a man who ignored abuse of power. So instead of being discouraged, I felt a current of anticipation, because the wheels of something larger had begun to turn. Langford had stayed at the cabin for hours after she left, poring through the files I had collected over the past year, letters from residents who had been fined thousands for absurd infractions like grass 2 inches too tall pictures, of contractors harassed by Karen's patrols for parking on public streets, even a retired couple who had been threatened with foreclosure because they painted their porch a shade of blue, not approved by the board despite there being no bylaw regulating paint colors. He took notes with the patience of a man used to unraveling tangled webs, and every so often he would shake his head and mutter, "Unbelievable. Absolutely unbelievable." When I asked him what the next step was, he told me that while his office had authority to investigate, it would be far more powerful to build a case from the ground up, with first-hand accounts from homeowners willing to speak, because once those testimonies were collected, the HOA would have no room to wriggle free, and Karen, as president, would be personally accountable. I offered to help connect him with the community, since as both a local ranch owner and a law enforcement officer, people trusted me more than they trusted faceless government officials, and Langford agreed, suggesting we hold informal meetings where residents could speak safely without fear of retaliation. That was the beginning of a long, meticulous campaign, one that Karen unknowingly fueled with every new outburst, because the more she tried to clamp down, the more people reached out to me, desperate for relief. The first meeting was held at the cabin a week later, under the cover of a casual gathering, just neighbors invited for coffee and barbecue. Nothing unusual to an outsider, but behind the laughter and clinking of plates, people unburdened themselves. In hushed tones, sharing stories of fines, threats, intimidation, and humiliation at Karen's hands. One man described how his wife had been brought to tears after receiving a violation for unauthorized flower beds, even though the flowers were in pots on their porch. Another family revealed that Karen had blocked their contractor from finishing their roof repair because she claimed the shingles were the wrong shade of gray. Langford sat with his notepad, recording details, his eyes sharp, his demeanor calm, and I could see the relief on people's faces as they realized their voices were finally being heard by someone with real power. But of course word traveled quickly in a neighborhood like ours, and by the second gathering, Karen had caught wind that something was happening, though she didn't yet know the Attorney General was directly involved. She showed up uninvited, striding up the gravel driveway of my cabin like she owned the land, her phone held high as if recording evidence, shouting that this was an unauthorized HOA meeting and demanding it be shut down immediately. I stepped out to block her path, reminding her firmly that my property was private, not under HOA jurisdiction, and that she had no right to interfere, but she screamed over me, threatening fines, lawsuits, even arrest, though she had no legal authority to enforce any of it. Langford, who had been inside speaking with residents, finally stepped out onto the porch, his presence commanding instant silence. Karen froze when she saw him again, her face twisting in disbelief that he was still here, and I could almost read her thoughts. She had hoped maybe she had imagined it the first time, that maybe he was just some lawyer friend of mine, not the actual state attorney general. But when he spoke, his voice left no room for doubt. "Miss Walker, you've been warned once already about trespassing. Do you intend to add intimidation of witnesses to your growing list of offenses?" The way the other neighbors stared at her phones discreetly recording was priceless. For the first time, Karen's grip on the community was slipping, and she knew it. She sputtered something about protecting property values and community standards, but her voice was thinner now, less commanding, almost desperate. Langford reminded her, calmly but firmly, that interfering with residents as they provided testimony to a state investigation could result in serious consequences, and that she would be wise to leave immediately. Karen left, but not before hissing at me that I was destroying everything she had built and that she would make me regret this. I let her threats roll off me because I knew at this point she was flailing, and when tyrants flail, they reveal their weakest points. Over the next few weeks, the investigation deepened. Langford's office set up a confidential hotline for residents, and calls poured in, each one adding fuel to the fire. We learned that Karen had been pocketing portions of HOA fees for administrative expenses that didn't exist, that she had manipulated elections by disqualifying candidates she didn't like, and that she had used HOA funds to landscape her own backyard while rejecting legitimate requests for maintenance elsewhere. Every stone we turned over revealed more rot, and Langford was meticulous in gathering evidence, ensuring nothing could be dismissed as hearsay. Meanwhile, Karen doubled down on her tactics, plastering the neighborhood with threatening notices, hiring private security to patrol streets, and even trying to tow cars parked at my cabin despite having no authority there. It became almost comical, her desperation so transparent that even her allies on the board began to distance themselves, whispering apologies when no one was watching, though none of them had the courage to openly defy her yet. I, on the other hand, wasn't interested in apologies. I wanted accountability, and Langford promised me it was coming. One evening, after another long session of gathering testimonies, Langford leaned back in his chair, steepled his fingers, and said, "You know, I've handled corrupt officials, fraudulent corporations, even organized crime rings. But there's something uniquely vicious about HOA tyrants. They hide behind the illusion of community while preying on it. That makes them dangerous. I nodded because I had lived it, and now I was watching the community finally begin to see it too. What started as fear was turning into resolve. Neighbors who once whispered in secret were now speaking openly, emboldened by the knowledge that Karen's reign was coming to an end. But Karen, true to form, wasn't going to let it end quietly. The night before Langford was set to file preliminary charges against the HO, my cabin was broken into. I had been in town, returning late, when I found the back door ajar, muddy footprints leading inside, and papers scattered across the floor where someone had rifled through them. Fortunately, I had anticipated such a move and had secured duplicates of all documents with Langford's office, so nothing critical was lost, but the violation of my sanctuary made my blood boil. The sheriff's department dusted for prints, and while nothing came back immediately, I had a strong suspicion whose hands were behind it. When I told Langford, he just gave a thin smile and said, "If she's foolish enough to cross into criminal territory, that only strengthens our case." And that was the moment I realized Karen had dug herself into a hole too deep to climb out of. Because she wasn't just fighting me anymore, she was fighting the law itself, and the law had longer arms than even her arrogance could reach. The morning after the break-in at my cabin, I woke to the sound of my phone buzzing nonstop, and when I finally picked it up, I found a storm of voicemails and text messages from neighbors warning me that Karen had convened an emergency HOA meeting at the clubhouse the night before. One she described as a session to save the community from corruption and betrayal, but in reality it was a spectacle designed to smear me and anyone who dared stand against her. And according to the reports, she stood at the front of the room waving around printouts of photos she had taken of my cabin, accusing me of running an illegal anti-HO organization, and even insinuating I was plotting to bankrupt the neighborhood by conspiring with outside investors. Her wild claims met with nervous applause from a handful of die-hard loyalists, while the rest of the room sat silent, visibly uncomfortable but too afraid to challenge her directly. What made it worse was that she began calling out names, publicly shaming those she suspected of attending the gatherings at my cabin, labeling them as traitors to the community, and even threatening to revoke their voting rights in the upcoming board election. It was the most brazen display of authoritarian theatrics I had ever heard of in a neighborhood association, and it might have worked months ago when people were still cowed by her intimidation, but now that Langford's investigation had started shifting the balance, her antics came across as desperate bluster. Still, the danger of her power grabs was real, because even a cornered tyrant can cause damage. So Langford and I met that afternoon at the sheriff's office, reviewing not only her outrageous claims, but also the mounting evidence that she was crossing legal lines faster than we could document them. He explained that what she was doing at the clubhouse could easily fall under the category of intimidation and retaliation against witnesses, which in the context of a state-level investigation was not just a civil issue but a criminal one, and he promised that his office would pursue it. Meanwhile, I decided to lean into the growing cracks in her influence by speaking directly with residents who were still on the fence, the ones too nervous to come forward but equally fed up with her rule. Over the next week, I walked door to door, listening to their fears, explaining that the Attorney General himself was leading this fight and assuring them that their voices mattered. Some were skeptical at first, asking if Karen would really face consequences or if she would just wriggle out of it like she always had. But I reminded them that this wasn't just me against her anymore. This was the law against her, and she couldn't bully the law into submission. Slowly but surely, more people began to trust the process, and with each new testimony, Langford's case grew stronger. But Karen wasn't about to sit quietly while her empire crumbled. Her next move was bolder and far more reckless. She hired a private legal firm, one of those slick, aggressive outfits known for drowning opponents in paperwork, to send cease and desist letters not only to me but to several neighbors suspected of cooperating with the investigation, claiming defamation, slander, and interference with HOA operations. The letters were intimidating on the surface, printed on expensive letterhead with heavy legal jargon, but Langford assured us they were nothing more than scare tactics, and he had his office draft official responses that not only dismissed the claims but warned Karen's attorneys that they were now interfering with a state investigation, which could put them in serious jeopardy if they continued. The brilliance of it was that Karen didn't realize she was walking into a trap, because the more she escalated with bogus legal threats, the easier it became to demonstrate a pattern of intimidation. In the meantime, tensions in the neighborhood reached a boiling point. The clubhouse parking lot became a battleground of whispered arguments, with residents openly questioning her leadership for the first time, and I started receiving quiet thanks from people who, just weeks ago, wouldn't have dared speak to me in public. One evening, a retired teacher named Mrs. Crawford stopped me at the general store, her hands trembling as she handed me a manila envelope. Inside were copies of bank statements and invoices that showed Karen had approved thousands of dollars in consulting fees to a shell company owned by her cousin, money that was supposed to go toward community maintenance projects. "I couldn't stay silent anymore," Mrs. Crawford whispered, her eyes darting nervously toward the door, and I assured her she had done the right thing, promising that the evidence would be secured. Langford nearly jumped out of his chair when he saw the documents, calling them the smoking gun he had been waiting for, and he told me that, once corroborated, this kind of embezzlement could bring not just civil penalties but criminal charges with serious prison time. Still, Karen pressed forward as if invincible, perhaps deluding herself that her web of threats and manipulations could hold. And her final act of desperation that month was to organize what she called a community security patrol, essentially deputizing her most loyal supporters to walk the streets at night, shining flashlights into people's yards and documenting supposed violations. It was harassment disguised as vigilance, and it infuriated the neighborhood, especially when one of the so-called patrols trespassed into the backyard of a young family and frightened their children. That incident became a turning point. The parents filed a formal complaint, not just with the HOA but with the sheriff's office, and Langford used it to illustrate in court filings how far Karen's abuse of power had gone. Behind the scenes, he was preparing the legal machinery for something bigger, something decisive, but he cautioned patience, explaining that timing mattered if we wanted to make the charges stick. Meanwhile, I fortified the cabin, installing new locks, cameras, and alarms, knowing Karen's next attempt might not be limited to rifling through papers. And sure enough, late one night, the motion sensor alerted me to movement outside. I grabbed my flashlight and sidearm, stepping cautiously onto the porch, only to catch sight of two figures darting into the tree line, one of them unmistakably wearing the red windbreaker Karen favored at HOA functions. They had been snooping again, but this time they knew they were being watched, and I made sure the security footage was backed up in 3 different places before handing a copy to Langford. The following morning, the Attorney General sat across from me with a steely look in his eyes and said, "It's time. We're moving to dismantle her power completely." That declaration filled me with a grim satisfaction, because after months of scheming and intimidation, Karen had finally overplayed her hand, and the law was about to strike back harder than she ever imagined. But even then, part of me knew she wouldn't go down without attempting one last stunt, something reckless enough to shock the community into rallying behind her, or so she thought, and as events began to accelerate, I braced myself for the inevitable clash that would decide not just the fate of our neighborhood, but the legacy of her destructive reign. The announcement from Langford that the Attorney General's office was ready to move forward against Karen set the stage for what would become one of the most dramatic unravelings of an HO empire I had ever witnessed, and while part of me relished the thought of seeing her dragged into court and forced to answer for her abuses, another part of me knew that the days ahead would not be calm or quiet, because Karen had never been the type to surrender gracefully. She was a cornered animal, dangerous and unpredictable, and when she sensed her grip slipping, she lashed out with every weapon at her disposal, no matter how destructive. The first salvo came in the form of a mass email she blasted to every resident in the community, a manifesto laced with paranoia and venom in which she accused me of colluding with corrupt state officials to overthrow the AOA, claimed the Attorney General himself was on my payroll and even went so far as to suggest that our neighborhood would be seized by the government and turned into low-income housing if she were removed. It was pure fear-mongering, riddled with lies. But for some residents, especially the elderly and easily frightened, it sowed just enough doubt to make them nervous, and Karen capitalized on that by scheduling a community defense rally on the clubhouse lawn. Langford advised me not to attend, warning that Karen might be looking to provoke a confrontation she could spin to her advantage, but I couldn't resist driving by just to see what she was up to. What I witnessed was equal parts pathetic and chilling. Karen standing on a makeshift stage with a bullhorn, rallying a dwindling crowd of loyalists while security lights illuminated handmade signs that read, "Save our community" and "Stop the takeover." She painted herself as a martyr, the only one standing between the neighborhood and destruction, but the cracks were obvious even as she bellowed into the bullhorn. People were slipping quietly away, shaking their heads at the absurdity. Still, the spectacle underscored how dangerous she remained, because desperation can lead to recklessness, and recklessness was Karen's specialty. Sure enough, her next move escalated things to a whole new level. She filed a temporary restraining order against me, Langford, and even the Attorney General's office, alleging harassment, stalking, and unlawful interference in HOA operations. It was laughable from a legal standpoint, but it forced us into court for a preliminary hearing, and that turned out to be the moment where the tide shifted irreversibly. Standing before the judge, Karen strutted in with a stack of binders and a smirk flanked by her high-priced attorneys, certain she could bury us in theatrics. But Langford, calm and deliberate, dismantled her case piece by piece, presenting the financial records Mrs. Crawford had provided, the security footage of Karen prowling outside my cabin, and sworn statements from multiple residents who had been threatened with retaliation. By the time he was finished, Karen's attorneys looked visibly rattled, and the judge not only denied her restraining order, but openly questioned the legality of her actions as HOA president, hinting at the possibility of appointing an outside administrator to oversee the association until the investigation concluded. Karen stormed out of the courtroom red-faced. Her illusion of invincibility cracked wide open, and word of her defeat spread like wildfire through the neighborhood. For the first time, people who had been silent out of fear began speaking openly. Against her, and small gatherings at the general store or the lakeside cafe turned into impromptu organizing sessions, with residents swapping stories, sharing evidence, and pledging to support the Attorney General's efforts. It was as if a dam had burst, releasing years of pent-up frustration, and Karen, sensing her empire collapsing, responded with a stunt so outrageous it bordered on self-destruction. She announced a special emergency HOA assessment of $10,000 per household, claiming the funds were needed for legal defense and community preservation, and she declared that non-payment would result in property liens. That single move detonated whatever shreds of support she had left, because even her most loyal followers balked at handing over that kind of money for her personal legal battles. Several families flat out refused, sending copies of the assessment, letters straight to Langford's office, and within days the Attorney General filed a motion to freeze HOA accounts pending investigation into misuse of funds. The judge granted it, effectively cutting off Karen's financial lifeline, and in response she grew more erratic, lashing out at anyone who crossed her, patrolling the neighborhood in her SUV with a clipboard in hand, stopping to photograph. Violations like unmowed grass or kids' bikes left in driveways. But the harder she pushed, the more people resisted, and finally, the Attorney General made his move, a sweeping civil suit combined with criminal charges of embezzlement, witness intimidation, and misuse of authority. The filing was made public, and news crews descended on our quiet lakeside community, eager to capture the story of an HOA tyrant brought to heel. Karen, of course, tried to spin it, giving impromptu press conferences on the clubhouse steps where she ranted about government overreach and conspiracies, but the cameras caught the fear in her eyes, the cracks in her composure, and the image of her shouting incoherently while residents walked past holding signs that read "Accountability Now" became the defining moment of her downfall. Still, even cornered, Karen had one last stunt up her sleeve. She attempted to shut down the community entirely by locking the gates and hiring private guards to block access, a move that not only violated local ordinances but also triggered a swift response from the sheriff's department. Langford himself led the operation, cutting the locks and escorting residents back to their homes, while Karen stood by screaming about her rights until she was physically restrained. The footage of her meltdown aired that night on every local news station, and by the following morning, the state had formally stripped her of her HOA presidency, appointing an interim administrator while the case proceeded. For the first time in years, the neighborhood felt free, though the scars of Karen's reign were still raw, and while I took no small satisfaction in seeing her empire crumble, I knew the story wasn't over not until the court handed down its final ruling and she faced real consequences for the damage she had done. And as I stood once again on the porch of my cabin, watching the sun set over the lake, I couldn't help but reflect on how surreal it all was. One woman's obsession with control had nearly destroyed an entire community. But in the end, it was that same obsession that undid her, because when you build power on fear and lies, it only takes a little truth to bring the whole thing crashing down. The final chapter of Karen's saga unfolded in the courtroom, a setting that seemed almost tailor-made to strip away the bluster and theatrics she had thrived on for years, because in that stark chamber of law, with its high ceilings, polished wood, and the eyes of the public fixed on her every move, there was no HOA rulebook she could twist, no clipboard she could wave around, no late-night intimidation letters she could slip into mailboxes only the cold, unyielding machinery of justice grinding forward, indifferent to her self-importance. And from the very first day of trial, it was clear that the weight of evidence Langford and the Attorney General's office had assembled was going to crush her carefully manufactured empire. The prosecution opened with a devastating slideshow of her own financial ledgers, painstakingly reconstructed from scraps and files she had tried to conceal, showing hundreds of thousands of dollars siphoned from community accounts into shell companies and personal luxuries, vacations disguised as outreach trips, jewelry listed as meeting supplies, even a brand-new SUV classified as a community emergency vehicle. Gasps rippled through the gallery as each transaction flashed across the screen, and Karen, sitting stiffly in her tailored blazer, tried to maintain her trademark smirk. But the strain was visible, her jaw clenched, her eyes darted nervously, and her pen tapped furiously against the table as though she could drown out the damning rhythm of numbers stacking against her. When residents took the stand, the damage deepened, one after another. They recounted years of harassment, extortion, and humiliation, from petty fines for leaving holiday decorations up a day too long to threats of foreclosure for refusing to cave to her arbitrary demands, and the cumulative effect was overwhelming, painting a portrait not of a misunderstood leader, but of a petty tyrant who had weaponized authority for personal gain. Then came the bombshell. Mrs. Crawford, frail but resolute, wheeled into the witness stand and produced the handwritten notes Karen had once carelessly left behind in a rush to conceal her activities, notes that laid out in Karen's own words the scheme to bleed the HOA dry while keeping residents too intimidated to resist. The courtroom was silent as those pages were read aloud, Karen's phrases dripping with arrogance and contempt. They'll pay whatever I tell them to pay. Fear keeps them quiet. No one dares challenge me. It was a mirror held up to her soul, and for the first time, Karen's facade shattered. She slammed her hand against the table, shouting about forgeries and lies, earning a sharp reprimand from the judge and a visible recoil from her own defense team, who by then looked more like men counting the minutes until they could wash their hands of her. Outside the courtroom, the media frenzy reached a fever pitch, with news vans lining the courthouse steps and commentators dubbing her the a queen who fell from power. And while I usually had no taste for such spectacles, I couldn't deny the satisfaction of watching her finally face the public accountability she had dodged for so long. Still, the trial stretched on, as her attorneys grasped desperately for defenses claiming mismanagement rather than malice, blaming subordinates, even suggesting she was the victim of a smear campaign, but Langford methodically dismantled every argument, his calm precision a perfect foil to Karen's outbursts. Then, in the final week, the prosecution unveiled the footage from my cabin security cameras, the night she had broken in uninvited, stomping through the halls and rifling through my things while unaware that the Attorney General himself sat in the next room. The irony was not lost on anyone, and the jurors' faces hardened as they watched her arrogance laid bare, a trespass that symbolized her entire approach to power, barging into spaces that weren't hers, convinced she was untouchable. When the closing arguments were delivered, Langford's words cut like a blade. This is not about HOA rules or neighborhood disagreements. This is about abuse of power, theft, and intimidation. It is about one woman who placed herself above the law and a community that suffered because of it. But today she stands accountable not to her rules, but to ours, the law of this state and the will of its people. Karen's defense tried to appeal to pity, painting her as overworked and misunderstood, but the jury wasn't swayed. After 2 days of deliberation, they returned with a verdict, guilty on all counts: embezzlement, fraud, intimidation, and criminal trespass. The judge, stern and deliberate, sentenced her not only to years in prison, but also ordered restitution to the community, stripping her of her ill-gotten assets and ensuring she would never again hold authority over so much as a neighborhood bake sale. The gavel struck, sealing her fate, and in that moment a weight seemed to lift from the entire gallery. Residents who had once cowered in silence embraced, some with tears streaming down their faces as though they had been waiting years for this moment of liberation. As Karen was led away in cuffs, screaming about appeals and conspiracies, I felt no triumph, only a deep, steady relief, because justice had spoken, and it had spoken clearly. In the months that followed, the neighborhood transformed, no longer under the shadow of Karen's iron grip. The residents voted to dissolve the HOA, replacing it with a cooperative model that prioritized transparency and community input. Where once fear and resentment had festered, there was now laughter at block parties, shared labor on community projects, and even an annual lakeside barbecue held on the grounds where Karen had once ruled with paranoia. My cabin, once a point of contention, became a gathering place, a symbol of how far we had come. And though I never sought the role, I found myself a kind of informal steward of the new order, helping neighbors coordinate, lending advice, and reminding everyone that power belonged to the people, not to one person with a clipboard and a hunger for control. Langford remained a close friend, often visiting to fish off the dock or simply enjoy the quiet, and together we would reflect on how one person's arrogance had nearly destroyed everything, only to become the catalyst for renewal. As for Karen, the last I heard, she was adjusting poorly to prison life, her complaints about the unfairness of it all falling on deaf ears, because outside those walls the world had moved on without her. And as I stood on my porch one evening, watching the sunset paint the lake in gold and crimson, I realized that this wasn't just the end of Karen's reign, it was the beginning of something better, a community bound not by fear but by resilience, not by control but by trust. And those scars remained. They were reminders of what we had survived and what we would never allow again. In the end, Karen had burst into my cabin believing she could impose her will on me, but she had walked straight into the heart of her undoing. Because when arrogance meets truth, truth always wins, and now the lake was calm, the cabin was peaceful.